What would you do if your boss ignored every warning you gave, cost the company $1.8 million, and then tried to blame you for it? I will tell you exactly how I turned that trap into their downfall. This is also the reason I am here and I'm about to tell you my story. My name is Lauren Hayes. I am 38 years old, born and raised in a small town in Ohio where my father used to say that hard work was its own reward. For nearly 10 years, I have been a senior contract manager at Everline Systems, a mid-sized software company in Boston that I once believed was my professional home. I have worked late nights drafting airtight agreements, caught mistakes that saved the company millions, and trained junior staff until they could stand on their own. I thought I'd built something here, not just a career, but a place where my loyalty and skill meant something. That belief would be tested in ways I never imagined, and it started on a spring morning in 2022 that I will never forget. I had applied for the Director of Vendor Relations position, a role that seemed like the natural next step after years of managing the most complex vendor accounts. My performance reviews had been spotless. The team knew me. The executives knew me. My track record was not just strong. It was unshakable. I walked into that conference room expecting a discussion about strategy and transition plans, maybe even a quiet nod from my boss, Victor Reed, to acknowledge what I had earned. Instead, I sat there, pen poised over my notebook, as Victor cleared his throat and made an announcement that felt like a slap I could not see coming. He said the promotion was going to Mason Clark. Mason was 24 years old, a so-called strategic consultant who had been with us for less than 6 months. He was clever, I will give him that, but his cleverness was the kind that leaned on charm instead of substance. I had seen him stumble through contract terminology more than once, covering it with a confident smile as if words could erase ignorance. Victor called him a visionary thinker and praised his fresh perspective and creative approach to contracts. It was the kind of language that sounds impressive until you remember that contracts are about precision, not creativity. I forced myself to smile, to keep my face as still as glass, but inside my stomach was twisting. I could feel a tightness in my chest, the kind that warns you something bad is brewing. Mason was sitting 2 seats away, nodding like a politician giving thanks after winning an election he never campaigned for. He glanced at me once, and I could swear there was a flicker of smugness in his eyes, as if he already knew that my knowledge, my experience, my history here meant nothing compared to Victor's preference for new and shiny things. In that moment, a bitter truth settled over me. Promotions at Everline were not always about merit. Sometimes they were about alliances. And this alliance between Victor and Mason was new but already dangerous. I knew how these stories went. An inexperienced leader makes a bold change, ignores seasoned advice, and leaves a trail of costly mistakes. The question was never if it would happen, but when. And I knew, without a doubt, I would be standing close enough to feel the fallout. Irene and the rest of the meeting blurred into a haze of congratulatory remarks, performance targets, and vague promises about collaboration. I nodded at all the right times. I even shook Mason's hand when the meeting ended, because that is what you do in the corporate world. You play the role. But as I walked back to my desk, the hum of the open office felt different. My mind was already moving in ways it had not in years. I knew I would have to protect myself, my work, and my reputation, because I had just been placed in the shadow of someone who did not understand the weight of the role he had been given. I wish I could say I felt only hurt, but that would not be true. There was something else simmering beneath it. Resentment, sharp and quiet. Not the kind that lashes out in the moment, but the kind that watches, waits, and remembers. I had no intention of sabotaging Mason or Victor. That was not my way. But I knew enough about business to understand that recklessness has a habit of revealing itself. And when it did, I would be ready with the truth. I sat down at my desk, opened my email, and began my day as if nothing had happened. But in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that this was not just a missed promotion. This was the start of something bigger. Something that would test my patience, sharpen my instincts, and eventually turn the tables in ways none of them could have predicted. I did not know exactly when, but I knew this. One day, the very people who overlooked me would have no choice but to see me clearly. And when that day came, I would not need their approval. I would have something far more powerful. It did not take long for the cracks to show. Barely 2 weeks after Mason's promotion, I found myself sitting in a project meeting where the air felt thick with overconfidence. Mason was leading the discussion, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the department rested lightly on his shoulders. Beside him, Victor nodded at every suggestion like a proud mentor watching his protégé perform. I listened in silence as Mason laid out what he called a cost-saving breakthrough. His plan was to cut ties with one of our largest and most reliable vendors, a partner we had worked with for 8 years, and replace them with a smaller, cheaper startup. The younger staff around the table were nodding as though they were witnessing innovation, but I could already feel the flaw pulsing beneath every word he spoke. I waited until he finished his presentation, then asked a single question. "Have you reviewed the termination clause in our current vendor agreement?" Mason blinked, his confident smile faltering for just a second. "I have," he said quickly, "but it is nothing we cannot negotiate our way out of." I felt my jaw tighten. I had written part of that contract myself. The clause was explicit. Terminating early without cause would incur a penalty of up to $1.8 million. It was not a number that lived in theory. It was binding, enforceable, and not open to the kind of negotiation Mason seemed to imagine. I explained this calmly, outlining the legal and financial risks, even pointing to the precise section and subsection in the contract where the penalty was detailed. Victor leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Lauren," he said, in the tone managers use when they think they are speaking to someone too cautious to see opportunity, "you have been in this role a long time. Sometimes, we have to take calculated risks to get ahead. This vendor is charging too much for what we get, and this new partnership could save us $500,000 a year." His eyes met mine, firm, but not unkind. Though the message was clear. He was siding with Mason. I wanted to push harder, to demand they take a second look, but I knew the room was not on my side. Mason's voice carried the easy bravado of someone who had never been burned by a contract before. He spoke about breaking free from outdated deals and embracing the future as if words could dissolve legal obligations. I could feel the momentum in the room slipping away from reason and into the dangerous comfort of group agreement. In that moment, I made a decision. If they were determined to move forward despite my warnings, then I would not argue endlessly in circles. I would document. I would keep every word, every email, every timestamp. It was not about winning an argument anymore. It was about protecting myself from the inevitable fallout that I knew was coming. And the meeting ended with polite nods and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. As we filed out, Mason clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "Do not worry, Lauren," he said, with that grin that had begun to wear thin. "We have got this under control." I smiled back, but inside, I thought, "You have no idea what you are playing with." Back at my desk, I opened the contract on my screen, highlighting the penalty clause and saving it to my personal records. Then I started a new file on my desktop, a quiet little folder tucked away where no one would notice. I named it Vendor Transition Notes. It was the first entry in what would become a detailed chronicle of every step they took toward disaster. I did not know exactly when the bill for their decision would come due, but I knew it would. And when it did, I intended to be ready. With every fact, every piece of proof, and no room for doubt about who had caused it. 3 months later, the storm arrived. It did not come with warning signs or whispered rumors. It came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope stamped with the logo of our former vendor and the words "Legal Notice" in bold type. I was in the middle of reviewing another contract when the courier dropped it on my desk. The weight of it in my hands told me everything before I even opened it. I broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and there it was in black and white. Everline Systems owed $1.8 million in damages for breach of contract. Not might owe, not could owe, owed, final, non-negotiable. My pulse quickened, but not from surprise. I had been waiting for this moment from the day Mason pitched his cost-saving breakthrough. The vendor's lawyers had cited the exact clause I had warned about, referencing our dates of termination and their corresponding penalties with surgical precision. It was not an overreach. It was not a threat. It was a legal certainty. We had walked directly into the trap I had described to them in detail, and now the jaws had closed. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers. $1.8 million. Nearly wiping out the profit margin for the quarter, possibly triggering layoffs in other departments, maybe even hurting our standing with shareholders. I wondered if Mason had seen the letter yet, or if Victor was sitting in his office at that very moment trying to spin it into something less catastrophic. My phone buzzed. It was a calendar invite from Victor. Urgent meeting, 1:00 p.m., conference room B. No subject line. No explanation. Just the time and place. When I walked into the conference room that afternoon, Victor was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Mason was seated at the far end of the table, looking paler than I had ever seen him. He gave me a quick, forced smile that disappeared before it fully formed. On the table sat copies of the letter, one at each seat, as if we were all guests at a dinner where the main course was failure. Victor's tone was calm, almost too calm, when he spoke. "The vendor is demanding payment," he said, "but we are going to challenge this." I raised an eyebrow. "Challenge it on what grounds?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "The clause is clear. We broke the contract without cause. We agreed to the penalty." His jaw tightened. "Not necessarily. They might be bluffing." I almost laughed at that, but I swallowed it. Bluffing. Vendors do not bluff when the ink on the clause is still fresh and the math is on their side. As for the rest of the meeting, Victor and Mason discussed ways to delay, to push back, to frame the breach as mutual dissatisfaction with the vendor's services. None of it would stand up in arbitration. They knew it. I knew it. But what unsettled me most was not the desperate flailing. It was the way Victor kept glancing at me, as though he was already drafting a version of events where my name played a supporting role in their defense. That night, long after most of the office had gone dark, I stayed at my desk, reading through the original contract again. Every clause, every subclause, every initialed page. I made another copy for my personal folder, this time including my original email to Victor and Mason outlining the penalty risks in plain language. If they were going to try to rewrite history, they would find me holding the unedited version. By the time I shut down my computer and grabbed my coat, the streets outside were quiet, and the building lights reflected off the wet pavement like a warning. $1.8 million. It was no longer a hypothetical. It was here. And I knew in my bones that before this was over, the cost to certain people's careers would be far higher than the cost to the company's bank account. It began quietly, like a slow leak in a pipe you cannot see but can already smell. The first sign was an email from HR, marked confidential, asking me to join a fact-finding session about the vendor penalty. It was scheduled for the following Monday. No agenda. No context. Just a time, a room number, and a request for my full cooperation. I read it twice, my stomach tightening with each line. I had been through enough corporate storms to recognize the tone. It was not curiosity. It was preparation. When I walked into the small conference room, Victor was already seated, arms folded, wearing the same calm mask he always wore when something was about to go badly for someone else. Beside him sat an HR representative I barely knew, her legal pad open, pen poised. Mason was nowhere in sight, which told me everything. This was not about collecting everyone's side of the story. This was about narrowing the spotlight until it landed squarely on me. Victor began, his voice low and deliberate, as though speaking to a jury. Lauren, the executive team has concerns that the vendor situation might have been avoidable had the risks been escalated more aggressively. He did not say, "your fault," outright, but the shape of the words was there, hovering between us like smoke. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind you feel when you see the punch coming and have just enough time to brace yourself. I leaned forward. Victor, I raised the penalty risk in the initial vendor transition meeting. I also sent you and Mason the clause in writing, with the financial impact clearly outlined. The HR rep kept writing, her pen scratching like a clock ticking too fast. Victor gave a small, measured nod. We are not disputing that you mentioned it, he said, but there is a difference between mentioning something and making sure it is understood at the highest level. That was the moment I knew their strategy. They were not going to deny that I had spoken up. They were going to argue that I had not done it loudly enough, that I should have bypassed Victor, Mason, and the entire chain of command to get my point directly to the CEO. In other words, they were going to rewrite the rulebook after the fact and hold me accountable for not following it. I kept my tone even, my face neutral. So, to be clear, I said, you are saying the written warning I provided, the meeting notes where it was discussed, and the direct responses I received dismissing the risk were insufficient? Victor glanced at the HR rep, then back at me. We are saying there may have been a breakdown in communication. It was a sentence polished by lawyers, designed to sound harmless while carving a path straight toward my credibility. When the meeting ended, I walked out without a word, my heels clicking against the polished floor like a metronome keeping time with my thoughts. I knew this game. I had watched others lose it. But I also knew something they did not. I had already built a wall of proof so high and so solid that not even Victor's spin could climb over it. Every email, every Slack message, every time-stamped warning was safe, copied, and backed up in a place no one could touch. They thought they were building a case against me. What they were really doing was laying the foundation for their own collapse. And I was more than willing to let them keep digging. Aha. The night after that HR ambush, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, the glow from the screen casting long shadows on the walls. The city outside was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I scrolled through my folders, each one neatly labeled and dated, like a library of every warning I had given about the vendor switch. It was all there. Emails with subject lines that left no room for misinterpretation. Slack threads where I spelled out the clause and the penalty in plain English, meeting notes with Victor's exact words dismissing my concerns. Every piece of it was time-stamped, saved twice, and backed up to an encrypted drive I kept in my desk at home. This was not paranoia. It was survival. I had learned early in my career that in corporate life, truth does not protect you unless you can prove it, and proof does not matter unless you can produce it at the exact moment it is needed. I did not know when that moment would come, but I knew it would. And when it did, I was not going to rely on memory or good faith. I would have the receipts. All of them. On the next morning at work, I acted as though nothing had changed. I greeted people in the hallway. I asked Mason how his weekend had been. I even offered Victor coffee when I passed him in the break room. I knew the value of looking harmless. Meanwhile, I kept my own quiet rhythm. Saving new emails to my archive, printing key messages, noting every conversation about the vendor penalty in a personal log. My colleagues saw a woman calmly doing her job. What they did not see was the wall I was building behind the scenes. Occasionally, I would catch Victor glancing at me in meetings, as if trying to gauge whether I was nervous. I was not. I was patient. Patience is a dangerous thing in the hands of someone who is already prepared for the worst. Each time they tried to push the narrative closer to me, I would ask innocent questions that required them to restate their version of events, knowing that each restatement would make the cracks in their story grow wider. One afternoon, Mason dropped by my desk with a smile that was just a little too forced. "Hey, Lauren," he said, "Victor and I were wondering if you could put together a summary of your communications with the vendor before the termination." I paused, just long enough for him to notice. "Of course," I said smoothly. "Do you want the brief version or the detailed one?" His smile faltered. Detailed, I guess." I nodded. "I will have it ready for the next leadership meeting." He walked away quickly, probably without realizing he had just given me the perfect reason to lay out my evidence in a setting where everyone who mattered would see it. At home that evening, I refined the summary. It was precise, chronological, and irrefutable. No embellishments, no emotional language. Just facts, dates, and their own words. As I read through it one last time, I felt that same quiet resolve I had felt from the beginning. They thought they were hunting me, but they had no idea I had been marking the trail behind them every step of the way. And soon, that trail would lead directly to the truth. When the invitation came on a Wednesday morning, hidden in the middle of my inbox between a vendor invoice and an internal newsletter. Subject line: Emergency Meeting. Vendor Penalty Review. The attendees list stopped me cold. Clara Bennett, our CEO. Aaron Mills, our CFO. The company's general counsel. Victor Reed. And me. No HR, no assistants, no buffer. This was not a discussion. This was Judgment Day. When I walked into the executive boardroom that afternoon, the air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels intentional, like a stage before the curtain rises. Clara was at the head of the table, expression unreadable. Aaron sat beside her, flipping through a packet of documents. Victor was already there, posture relaxed but his jaw set a fraction tighter than usual. Mason was absent, and I did not need to ask why. This was about leadership accountability now, and Mason had been conveniently moved out of the blast radius. Clara began without preamble. "We are here to understand exactly how this vendor penalty happened and where responsibility lies." Her voice was calm, but the weight in it made the words feel like they were carved in stone. Victor leaned forward slightly. "The penalty, you all regrettable, resulted from a communication gap regarding the termination clause. Certain details were not escalated in a way that allowed the executive team to act in time. My turn. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for weeks, though I did not need the rehearsal. Everything I needed was already in my folder. I placed it gently on the table, opened it, and slid a printed timeline toward Clara and Aaron. With respect, I said evenly. The details were escalated. Multiple times. In writing and in meetings. Aaron adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the pages. Clara began to read. My voice stayed steady as I walked them through the evidence. Dates of the initial warnings, the exact text of the emails I sent to both Victor and Mason, the meeting notes where I outlined the financial penalty in clear terms. At each point, I also provided their responses. Victor's dismissal of the clause as meaningless, Mason's assurance that they could negotiate their way out of it, the repeated decisions to proceed without further review. About halfway through, Victor tried to interject. Lauren, these were... I held up a hand, polite but firm. If I may finish, Victor. The room went quiet again. I clicked to the final slide in my presentation. A scanned copy of the contract clause itself, highlighted in yellow, with a note in the margin from our former vendor's legal team confirming its enforceability. It was the same section I had flagged months ago, unchanged, undeniable. Aaron's pen stopped moving. Clara set the papers down and looked at Victor. Is there any part of this that is inaccurate? She asked. Victor's mouth opened, then closed. I may have underestimated. She cut him off. It appears you ignored a documented warning and proceeded with a decision that cost this company nearly $2 million. Am I missing something? Silence. It was the kind that expands in a room, filling every corner until there is nowhere to hide. I did not gloat. I did not even smile. I simply folded my hands in front of me and waited. The meeting ended with Clara saying they would review next steps and revisit leadership assignments. I left the room with my folder still in my hand, my pulse finally slowing. The wall I had built was solid, and now everyone in that room had seen it for themselves. What they did with that truth was their decision. But one thing was certain. After today, there was no rewriting the story. When the fallout began almost immediately. By the next morning, whispers were moving through the office like a draft under a closed door. People did not know the full story yet, but they knew something had happened in the boardroom. When I arrived at my desk, the first thing I noticed was that Victor's office door, usually propped wide open, was shut tight, blinds drawn. Mason's desk sat empty, a mug half full of coffee still sitting there from the day before, as if he had left in a hurry and forgotten he might not be coming back. By mid-morning, Clara's assistant called me upstairs for a follow-up meeting. This time, it was just Clara, Aaron, and me. Clara got straight to the point. Lauren, thank you for providing such thorough documentation yesterday. It clarified a lot for us. She glanced at Aaron, who nodded once. Victor is on administrative leave, effective immediately. Mason's contract has been suspended pending review. Her tone was neutral, but the weight of those words landed like a stone in the center of the room. I did not ask questions. I simply said, understood. Inside, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a chess player watching the board shift exactly as planned. This was not about revenge for me. Not the kind that burns hot and loud. This was about the slow, inevitable gravity of truth pulling everything into its rightful place. That afternoon, a company-wide email went out. It was written in the usual corporate language: leadership transition, organizational alignment, appreciation for contributions. But everyone could read between the lines. The subtext was clear. Something had gone wrong, and the people responsible were no longer in control. I saw a few glances in my direction in the break room, but no one asked me outright. And I did not volunteer anything. Let them wonder. Later that day, I passed Mason in the hallway. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was never as solid as he thought. He opened his mouth to say something, but whatever it was died in his throat. I kept walking. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. The facts had already spoken, and they were louder than any conversation we could have had. Back at my desk, I opened my folder one last time, scanning the pages that had carried me through the storm. I thought about how close they had come to burying me under their mistakes. If I had not documented every detail, if I had trusted them to act in good faith, I would have been the one with my career on the line. Instead, I was still here, steady, and they were the ones unraveling. That night, I left the office later than usual. The building was quiet, most of the lights turned off, the air cool and still. I paused for a moment by the elevator, thinking about how quickly fortunes can flip when the truth is given a place to stand. It had taken patience. It had taken restraint. But most of all, it had taken proof. And proof, I knew now more than ever, is the one thing that cannot be spun, silenced, or erased. The official endings came faster than I expected. Less than 2 weeks after the boardroom showdown, Victor's name disappeared from the company directory. No farewell email, no awkward goodbye party, no polite speech about pursuing new opportunities. Just gone. The kind of exit that leaves only a whisper of his time here and a paper trail that would never see daylight. Mason's turn followed 3 days later. His departure was framed as a mutual decision to part ways, but the truth was written all over his face the last time I saw him. Shoulders slumped, a single cardboard box in his arms, the easy arrogance he had carried into the building months ago, replaced by a tight, hollow stare. And I did not watch him leave. I heard the quiet thud of the security door closing behind him and kept my eyes on my monitor. In my experience, you do not need to witness the fall to know it happened. The absence speaks louder than the event itself. Around the office, no one spoke openly about it, but there was a shift in the air. Conversations hushed when I walked past. Colleagues who had once doubted my caution now looked at me differently. Some with respect, some with the kind of curiosity that wondered what else I might be capable of. One morning, Clara stopped by my desk. It was rare for her to come down from the executive floor without notice. She leaned on the partition and said, "Lauren, I want you to take over vendor compliance and operations oversight for the next quarter. We will formalize things later, but for now, you will report directly to me." I nodded, keeping my voice steady. Of course. What I did not say was that I had been managing those responsibilities in the shadows for years. Only now, I was being given the authority to match the work. The transition was quiet but absolute. Emails that used to pass through Victor now came directly to me. Contracts Mason would have overseen never even touched his empty desk. There was no announcement beyond the necessary updates to workflow charts, but the shift was unmistakable. For the first time in months, I could focus on doing the job right without someone dismantling the safety nets I had put in place. I never gloated. That is not my nature. But I did allow myself one private moment of acknowledgement. Late one evening, long after most of the office had gone home, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The lights below shimmered like they had something to prove. In that reflection, I saw a woman who had been overlooked, underestimated, and nearly blamed into ruin. Now standing in the role she had been denied, not because someone handed it to her, but because she had earned it twice over. Victor and Mason would move on to other places, other opportunities, carrying with them the knowledge of what had happened here. I doubted they would speak my name in those stories, but that did not matter. The people who needed to know already did. And the truth, my truth, was secured in more than just the records I had kept. It was written into the silence that followed their exits and the stability that replaced their chaos. In corporate life, some careers end with applause. Others end with the sound of a door closing and the quiet knowledge that it will never open again. For Victor and Mason, it was the latter. And for me, it was the beginning of something they never saw coming. It happened without champagne, without applause, without the hollow cheer of a company-wide email. One morning, I logged into our internal directory and saw my title had changed. Senior Contract Manager no longer Now it read, Director of Vendor Compliance and Operations. There was no announcement, no photo op, no carefully staged post on the company's social media. Just a quiet edit in the system, as if it had always been that way. A few hours later, Clara called me into her office. She did not waste words. "Lauren, you have been doing this work for years. Now it is official. I know this promotion should have come sooner. Consider this our way of making things right." I thanked her, my tone calm and measured, though inside I felt the warmth of something I had not felt in months. Vindication. Not the kind that bursts out in celebration, but the kind that settles deep in your bones and stays there. In the days that followed, my workload shifted in subtle but important ways. Decisions that used to be filtered through Victor now landed directly on my desk. I had the authority to approve vendor changes, the power to renegotiate contracts before they reached the point of risk. Colleagues who had once treated my cautions as obstacles now sought my input before taking big steps. They had seen what happened when my warnings were ignored, and they would not make that mistake twice. Still, I carried myself the same way I always had. Measured, methodical, never letting the change in title alter the steadiness in my voice or the clarity in my decisions. I did not need to gloat, because the proof of what I had accomplished was everywhere, in every stable deal, every vendor relationship now built on trust instead of reckless shortcuts. One evening, I stayed late to finish a final round of contract revisions. The office was quiet, the hum of the HVAC the only sound. I leaned back in my chair and thought about the path that had brought me here. I remembered that spring meeting when Mason was announced as the new director, the knot in my stomach, the slow realization that I would be forced to watch someone else's recklessness put us all at risk. I remembered how easy it would have been to disengage, to let the chaos run its course and hope it did not touch me. But instead, I had chosen the harder path. The patient one, the deliberate one, the one that required me to prepare quietly while others underestimated me. Now, the desk I sat at was no longer in the shadow of someone else's decisions. It was my own. And while the title was nice, it was not the true reward. The real victory was knowing that I had held the line, told the truth, and refused to be erased when it would have been easiest to disappear. In business, recognition often comes in loud, public gestures. Mine came as a whisper, an update in the system, a private conversation with the CEO. And in its quietness, it meant more. Because I knew I had not just been given a role. I had claimed it, one documented fact at a time. Looking back now, I realize my victory did not arrive with fireworks. It came in the quiet shift of power, in the steady way the truth moved into the light, one piece of proof at a time. There was no single moment where I felt I had won. It was a slow, deliberate climb from the day they tried to make me the scapegoat to the day my title changed without fanfare. And perhaps that is why it means so much. Because nothing about it was handed to me. I had to hold my ground through every attempt to erase me. And if there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that in corporate life, noise fades, but records remain. People can twist memories, soften their own mistakes, or try to bury your contributions under their failures, but they cannot rewrite what is documented. Proof is the equalizer. It is the quiet ally that sits patiently until the moment it is needed, and when that moment comes, it speaks louder than anyone in the room. I never set out to destroy Victor or Mason. I did not have to. They built their own downfall, brick by brick, with every reckless choice they made. All I did was keep the blueprint of those choices and hand it to the right people when the time came. Revenge, I learned, does not have to be loud, and it does not have to be cruel. Sometimes the most devastating blow is to let someone's own actions close the door behind them. Even now, months later, I carry that lesson with me. I keep my records. I ask the questions no one wants to ask. And when I speak, I make sure my words are precise enough to stand on their own if they are ever read back in a different room on a different day. It is not paranoia. It is protection. Oiko is to anyone who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or blamed for what they tried to prevent. Know this: you do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to fight every battle in the open. Sometimes the most powerful move is to let the facts sit quietly until they are undeniable. The day will come when those facts will be the only thing standing, and when that happens, the people who tried to erase you will have no choice but to see you clearly. That is the lesson I keep. That is the reason I sleep soundly. Not because I beat them, but because I never let them take away the one thing that mattered. My truth.